Hey everybody, Chris here from It's Mead Made, and today we are demystifying the infill. We're going to be diving deep into the Cura settings when it comes to infill. We're going to be talking about our patterns, our density, what our line multiplier is. We're going to be talking about how we can save filament while making good supports. And we're also going to talk about how to make our infill more bonded to the outer walls of our 3D prints to make them even stronger. There's a lot to talk about, so let's go ahead and get in this video. So one thing I want to say before we even get started, if you're brand new to 3D printing, this might not be the video for you because we're going to go deep in the weeds of just the infill setting only. Now, I have created another video where I walk you through step by step of every single thing that you need to know when getting started 3D printing. And I'll go ahead and put a link to it up here or here. I think there. Watch that video, get comfortable, and then come back to this video. For the rest of you that are definitely here to get deep in the weeds of the infill settings, I've chaptered this video out for you so you can easily just skip ahead to the certain sections that you really want to know about. But I'll tell you this right now, if you just watch the whole thing, you're going to learn so much about infill. So let's go ahead and get into this video. So before we really get into this, I just wanted to remind you that I have a full video where I go through all of the settings that I think are important to look at when setting up your 3D prints. If you're interested, click that link right up here in the top right. Other than that, let's get back to the video. So first, let's talk about what is infill. Infill is that support pattern inside your 3D prints that provides structure, and it also helps with the form of your actual model. Because sometimes your 3D models don't just require supports on the outside of your model for overhangs. Overhangs can come inward on the model too. And that is where our infill really comes into play, because it provides a structure on the inside of your models to where those overhangs have something to actually print onto. And that is vital to help you get a better 3D print. So first, let's talk about our infill density. That refers to the amount of material we're using on the inside of our 3D print. So a higher density means there's going to be a lot more material. A lower density means there's a lot less material. And this is always measured in a percentage when it comes to Cura. So for example, if I have a 20% infill density, that means 80% of my model on the inside is not going to have any material. But on the other side of that, if I have an 80% density, that means only 20% of the inside of my model will not have any infill. With that said, it's important to understand that because it affects two things. One thing is it will actually affect the strength of your 3D print. So a higher density, a stronger 3D print. A lower density, a weaker 3D print, because there's not that strong structure on the inside of your model. But the second thing is time. The higher the density, the more time your 3D print will take because it's printing more material on the inside of the 3D print. So obviously, a lower density, it's going to print a lot faster. Now in Cura, there's also something called line infill distance, and this acts the same way as your density. So let's go ahead, jump into Cura, and I'm going to show you these two parameters and how to change them. So here we are in Cura, and I went ahead and just brought in this cube right here. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to go into our infill setting right here in this drop-down menu. Now, if you do not have all of the settings I have, you want to click on this hamburger icon and then come down here and go to all. That way we're going to see every single setting we have available to us in Cura. So right here on the top of the list is our infill density. So we have this at 20%, and our infill line density is at 6. So let's go ahead and slice this. Then if we go into our preview and then drag down, we can see there is our infill at 20%. Now if we drop this down to say 5% and we slice that, we can see that the infill got a lot bigger because it's scaled up. So now 95% of the inside of our 3D print is just air. There's nothing there, and it's only 5% is being filled up. Now let's go to the very extreme here. So let's go to 90% and slice this. Now you can see that there's a lot more infill. Almost our entire inside of our model is 3D printed with material, and only 10% of the inside of the model has nothing in it. Now this is super high. Now let me show you at 100%. Now at 100%, it is actually fully solid. Now, there is no gaps. This means that this is going to be a solid brick of PLA or whatever plastic you're using. So if you're looking for the strongest print you can physically get, 100% infill will definitely do the job for you. But I will say, if you're printing at 100%, that means your print time is going to skyrocket, and that is depending also on the size of your model. So if you have a small little print that you're prototyping and you need it to be strong, this is it. It's going to take you time, but this is what you're going to need. My recommendation, if you're prototyping things, do small tests with a lower infill, and then that final result, when you think you've got your design perfect, that's when you want to crank this up. So you're not wasting any more filament. And you at least know that the print is good. Now I just need to make it stronger. Now for those of you that aren't too worried about the strength of your 3D print, a lower infill is perfectly fine. I typically go anywhere between 5% and 15% when it comes to my infill density. And that is all dependent on how my 3D print is actually looking. So with this, and you see that I've got a big surface area on the very top of my model, depending on the number of top layers I have, a 5% would be just fine. Now I'm typically using 3 layers on my very top layer, just so I can accommodate those gaps, because you're going to have some droopage in between these bigger gaps. And there's also some other patterns that we can get into that will accommodate for that as well. Next, let's talk about the infill line distance. Now, these two numbers are interchangeable. So if I say I made this a 7 and then sliced it, you notice that right here, the infill density and the percentage changed. It's no longer available to edit. And what this is doing is this is actually giving me a set measurement between my infill lines. Now, when we're actually 3D printing it, this gap right here is 7 millimeters, and we're keeping it at a specific distance. So if I wanted this to be, say, 80, and then I slice it, this is actually going to decrease our infill. So you can see there's barely any infill. So let's say if I make this a 40 and slice it. Now you can see these lines right here for our infill are 40 millimeters apart. So the lower you go, the higher your actual density is. So if you're wanting to use your line infill distance, just remember the lower the number, the higher the infill. The higher the number, the lower the infill. So if I say I want these 5 millimeters apart, our density is going to be a lot higher. So let's talk about the infill pattern. And what I mean by the infill pattern is that specific pattern that is printing on the inside of your 3D print to be able to give it that structure or that strength and give you those supports on the inside of your 3D print. Now, when it comes to the types of infill, there are so many different kinds, and it can get overwhelming of which one should I use for specific prints, or should I just use one and stick with it? I would say it really depends on the type of model you're printing and what results you're wanting out of it. These categories are kind of broken down into certain areas, and let's talk about those specific categories first. So the first one is a strong 2D infill. A strong 2D infill is a two-dimensional infill that is only printing in one direction and then switches on the other layer, similar to a grid. And these are really good for, everyday prints that you just don't really care that much of, like, I just need some type of support and some kind of strength. And I don't care if it's super strong, but it'll work. And that's where the 2D infill really comes into play. The second one is a quick 2D infill. And these are really where you're not concerned about the strength, you really just need that support on the inside. And the nice thing about the quick 2D infill is obviously it's quicker. It prints faster, and these print the exact same way, similar to the grid, where it's just printing in one direction, and then the next layer it prints in another direction, to kind of stack those on there to give that support for your 3D print. The third kind is 3D infill. Now, 3D infill is inherently just stronger than a regular 2D infill because it is actually creating a three-dimensional support structure inside your 3D print. So it's creating angles and walls and different things inside that depending on the different types of infill that you're using. But what this is doing is it's making it stronger from all directions instead of just one specific direction when it comes to using a 2D infill. The fourth one is kind of a category all into itself, and that is a concentric infill. And what this does is creates a circle pattern or a spiral on the inside of your 3D print. And this allows it to be a little more flexible, so for flexible filaments, it's a great one to use. And it also uses less filament. Then you have the fifth category, and that is specifically targeted for those of you printing flexible filaments. Because you need to have a little bit of give and take when it comes to the internal structure. You want it to be able to support, but the strength is something you really don't want that much because you want to kind of crush it and bend it. So this category kind of spans all of the categories, and we're going to go into those in specifics. Now, when it comes to me telling you what is the best infill, I'm not going to, because there is no answer to that. It really depends on what you're actually 3D printing. Are you printing just some kind of little widget or something like that, and it doesn't really matter? Or is it a functional print, or is it a 3D model that you want to 3D print to actually just paint it? Something that the quality needs to be beautiful, or is it something you're prototyping? There's different answers for every single thing you're doing. So let's go through all of the infills and I'll explain the pros and cons of everything, and maybe that'll help you decide, maybe I need to start using this infill when I'm doing XYZ. So let's go into Cura and I'm going to show you how to change all of these infill patterns. If we want to change our infill pattern, we just go here to the third thing, infill pattern, and this is our drop down. We just click this and we can see this large list of different types of infills. So if we want to change it to say 3D cross, all we have to do is hit slice to preview it, and then we can see right there, there is our 3D cross. And then let's, for example, see a two-dimensional one, and that would be, let's say, triangles. And I'm going to slice that. And there you go. And there is triangles. So you can see the difference between a 3D and 2D different infill, because this one is just keeping that same pattern all the way up. But then let's say if I switch to cubic, which is a 3D infill, you'll see that this infill is actually moving because what it's doing is it is actually creating cubes inside of the infill. So I actually 3D printed all of the different infills Cura has to offer to just show you what they look like. But I didn't stop there. I also documented on how much material was used for each one of these and also how fast each one printed. So let's start out with no infill. So you can see that I have no infill in here and it's just the walls and the floor. So let's move on to the next one. So first is grid. This pattern consists of straight lines printed in a crisscross pattern. It's similar to lines, but it's also considered a strong 2D infill pattern. It provides pretty decent strength and good stability, because you can see how tight this is. Now we have lines. This pattern also consists of straight lines, hence the name lines, but they're spaced a little farther apart, and it prints more quickly. And this is considered a quick 2D infill pattern. It's a little weaker than a grid, but it's still pretty decent to use if you just need some inner supports. Now we have triangles, and triangles are diagonal lines just printed to be able to make triangles. Now this infill is considered a strong 2D infill pattern because it provides good strength and stability, because triangles naturally are strong shapes. One thing about triangles, this is also a good infill pattern when it comes to flexible filaments. So this is trihexagon. This pattern consists of triangles and hexagons printed in diagonal patterns. It's considered a strong 2D infill pattern because it also gives really good strength because it's combining hexagons and triangles. Now we have cubic. This pattern is cubic shapes printed in diagonal patterns, so the angles are coming out. It's a strong 3D infill pattern that gives you strength in all directions. So if you're looking to increase the strength of your infill, this one is an excellent one to use. Then we have octet. This pattern consists of octagonal shapes printed in a diagonal pattern, and this is considered a very strong infill pattern. a great one if you're wanting strength. Then quarter cubic. Quarter cubic is considered a strong infill pattern, and it is just like cubic, but it's cut in quarters to give a strong lattice structure. Now we have concentric, and this one is a series of circular patterns printed on the inside of your 3D print. So it matches the contours of the print you're printing. Another thing about this shape, this is fantastic for flexible filaments. Now we have zigzag. Zigzag is a gridded shape infill pattern, and it consists of diagonal lines printed continuously in one direction. And what that basically means is this is all a continuous line, so there's no starting and stopping with this. This is also considered a strong 2D infill. Now we have cross, and you can see why it's called cross, because it makes a bunch of little crosses. The great thing about this infill, it is really good for flexible filaments, because it's strong and it has a little give and take in it. Just like cross, this is cross 3D, and this is a flexible infill pattern that consists with intersecting lines printing in a crisscross pattern with added complexity to increase the strength. And like I said, this is a really good one to use if you're using flexible filament. Now we have gyroid, and gyroid is one of my favorite infills just because it looks cool and it's an incredibly strong 3D infill. It has a complex pattern that looks like a sponge or a coral, which I honestly love. It's a very organic looking infill, which is fantastic, and it's very, very strong. So all of the infills pretty much make sense when you're looking at them, all but one, and that is lightning. Lightning is one of those things that just seeing a 3D print, it looks like a jumbled mess. So let's jump into Cura and let me show you what lightning actually does. So I've went ahead and switched over to our lightning infill pattern, and this is at a 15% density. So if we start at the very bottom layer and work our way up of how the 3D print is going to print, now you can see that all we have right here so far is just this one little line of infill. And if we keep going up, you can see how it starts to branch out and more gets created. And it creates this lightning looking pattern, hence the name. But by the time it gets to the very top layer of your 3D print, it has created this lightning bolt effect pattern all over the top surface where it's going to be 3D printing. So let's go to the very next layer. So if we're on the very next layer and we can see how this is 3D printing, it's actually 3D printing over top of this lightning, and it's given enough structure for us to actually 3D print a top layer successfully. Now when lightning first came out, I was like, oh my god, this is amazing. I'm only going to use lightning from now on. But then I found some flaws in lightning. You don't want to use this for every single thing, because sometimes your 3D models require more infill structure. If you have just a very top surface or something with a subtle gradation, lightning is great. And if you don't need it to be strong. If you're painting your 3D prints and you're, say, printing a bust, something big that, only has maybe shoulders and a head, lightning's fantastic. I have used lightning on every bust since this has come out. But for those more intricate models, for the 3D prints with arms coming out and things like that, I found lightning doesn't work that great. Sometimes you need that extra structure to be able to just hold your prints together. And also give a little more strength to them because, if it's an arm sticking out, there's not a lot of filament there at the connection point, and you need that strength. And that's where other patterns will give you the strength you need. Lightning especially isn't very good when you're prototyping. Now, when you're prototyping, you want a little more strength so you can test your 3D prints. There's not a lot of strength here. You can break your 3D prints pretty easily with lightning because they're essentially hollow models, all except the very top of the model. So when you're deciding to use lightning, just think about this. Keep those things in mind. Do I need any kind of structural supports on the inside, or am I literally just needing something to help me with those very top layers?
Alright, for all of you data nerds out there, I thought I would just list all of this out so you guys can see the side-by-side comparisons. Now, the one thing I did not say is I printed all of these with a 20% infill. And here, we're saving minutes. And this could be multiplied greatly depending on how long your print is. So if you have a 1 or 2 day print, this could save you hours by looking at which one you should be selecting if you're trying to conserve time or filament. And speaking of time, these are the actual recorded times of how long my 3D prints took. Because I found that Cura's suggested print time of how long it's going to take is almost always incorrect. It's close, but not correct. And that was completely true for this. Every single one of them, except one. Now, overall, lightning, it just destroys all of the other infills. But I've already gone over the pros and cons of using lightning. It doesn't always work for your needs. So if we don't look at lightning, triangles actually printed the fastest, and it's a really strong 2D infill. If we're just looking at grams, they're all pretty much the same, except zigzag. Zigzag does use the most filament. But we can really see the differences when we look at the amount of meters of filament used for these infills. When it comes to the least amount, it's 3D Cross. 3D Cross only had 2.87 meters of filament being used, with a close second of just regular Cross. But the one thing is, if you look, it also has some of the longest print times. So if you're wanting to conserve filament, this is a good option, but you're going to have more time. But if you're looking for an infill that doesn't use a lot of filament and it prints fast, it looks like triangles is probably one of those that will do that for you.
All right, real quick, I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you to all of these amazing people supporting me on Patreon this month. If you want to be like these awesome people, you'll get exclusive access to my private Discord servers where we talk about everything. 3D printing, painting 3D prints, and even sharing our fails. But it's a great community. You can also get access to all of my behind-the-scenes content where I show you what I'm working on, and you can even have the opportunity to vote on the videos that I make. This video right here was what was voted on for this month. They want some more Cura tutorials, and guess what? Here they are. If you're interested, I'll leave a link below. Other than that, let's get back to the video. If you're looking for your infill to have a little more strength and a little more stability, there's a great setting that can help you with this. That setting is Connect Infill Lines. And let's look at this without it being checked. So without this being checked, you can just see right here, all it's doing is creating lines to create our infill pattern. So let's zoom in. And when we see here, it's just making lines. It's stopping the print, moving over here, and then it's creating another line. Now when we check this setting and hit slice again, so after we have Connect Infill Lines checked, let's see what it does. So it comes in and it creates our line. The next one is this one. So instead of picking up the nozzle and moving over here and then creating this line, you'll see that it's actually connecting those lines. So this is a continuous line. It makes a continuous line for your entire layer of your infill. Now, a few things to note. Sometimes this can actually increase your print time, and it will also increase the amount of filament it's using. But if you're really wanting some more stability and strength to your 3D print, this is the setting for you. So by default, Cura will actually print the infills at a 45-degree angle. And the reason for that is it's enabling both the X and Y motors at the same time. And this allows you to have faster 3D print times because it's moving both and it's covering more area. But sometimes, depending on your 3D print, you need to be able to turn that infill to be able to give it a little more structure and stability for whatever you might be printing. This is especially true when you're prototyping and you're creating these models where you need a little more strength in one direction than another. A couple examples, let's say you're 3D printing something really intricate, something really thin. If you change it to a 90-degree angle, so it's going back and forth, it will actually be able to give a little more strength to whatever that is. Let's say if somebody's holding a sword, you've got something thin and it's only barely touching it, so you're getting little X's here and there. But if you change it to a 90-degree angle, you'll be getting lines across it, and that will give it just a little more strength. Another example, let's say you're printing, say, a square pillar. And if you 3D print this at a 45-degree angle, you might not get the strength you want. But if you change it to a 90-degree angle, so the infill is parallel with the walls, that might give you enough strength to be able to make it as strong as you need it. So let me show you how to change this in Cura. So here I have my infill pattern set to grid, and you can see how they're going at a 45-degree angle. Now, if we come right here to infill line directions, you'll just see some brackets right here and a place you can put in things. Now, an important thing to notice is we have these brackets. we have to put our values inside these brackets. If we don't have brackets, it's not going to do anything because it's not going to know what to do. And we have two values, our x and our y. Now, if we wanted to turn these to a 90-degree angle, all we would have to do is go inside our brackets and type 90, 90. And what that is our x at 90 degrees and our y at 90 degrees. And now let's hit slice. Now you can see that our infill is at a 90-degree angle. But the cool thing here is you can also change each value. So let's say that I want my y infill at a 45-degree angle. Then we can hit slice. So you can see that it's printing a 90-degree angle and a 45-degree angle. You can create some really crazy packed infills with this, but I recommend keeping them at the same angle so it's using the infill as it's intended to be. An interesting feature that Cura allows you to do is also offset your infill. So it always centers your infill to your 3D model. But let's say that you don't want it centered. Maybe you want to offset it so you're making sure some certain infill patterns are hitting where the model top is. So let me show you where to change that. So I brought my density down to 2% so you can really understand what this does. You can see with this grid pattern, it is basically dead center of my 3D print. If I go to my infill offset of X and Y, this allows me to shift my infill. So let's put in, say, 20 millimeters. Then we slice it on the X offset. Now you can see it's actually moved over. It's still in the dead center on the Y, but the X moved to the right. Same thing here, but let's say that I want this point up here. So let's move this to 20 on our Y offset. Now this is very useful when you have a low density on your infill pattern. On higher infill patterns, I've found that this isn't very useful because it's covering all the surface areas that you absolutely need. When you have like a standard shape, let's say like this cube that we're using as an example, the infill can kind of get repetitive. It will always be starting the layer at a specific point, and then it'll be going around and around. This can also create your infill to be just a little bit weak. Not a lot, but it can. There's one setting in here that allows us to randomize how it starts our infill. One thing to note, doing a randomized infill start, that can sometimes lead to a longer print time because usually the infill starts right where the walls end, so it can easily just quickly jump over and start printing the infill. Randomizing it will actually, instead of moving it right where it's close to, it might move all the way across your print and then start there. Just keep that in mind, but it is something that will help you with the strength of your model. So let me show you where to change that. Now if we see here, it just got done printing the walls. Now it's going to be going into the infill. So if we go to the next step, it's going to be printing this. Since it was right here at this corner, it's going to go ahead and 3D print this infill line. Now let's come over here to Randomize Infill Start and check this box. Now, we're in the exact same position. You can see it just finished the outer wall and the nozzle is in this far right corner. Now, if we go to the next step, it jumps all the way to the opposite side of the model, and the first line of the infill it prints is this one, instead of this long one right here where it was already next to. So you can see how it would increase your print time. But this randomization can help with the strength of your infill. If you're trying to make your infill just that much stronger, there's one setting in here that can just, bam, now it's twice as strong. Let me show you where that's at. So I've got my grid now and it's at a 5% density so we can get a good idea of what this does. And what I'm talking about is our infill line multiplier. Now, by default, it's set to 1. And what this does is it increases the amount of lines for each infill line that it's creating. So we're at a 1 right now. Just to show you, let's increase this to a 3. Now, I'm going to hit slice on this, and you can see here, it is actually printing 3 lines for each line on our infill pattern. This is going to increase the strength of your infill like crazy because essentially it's treating your infill just like your walls when it comes to wall line count. But it is going to increase your print time and it will increase the amount of material you're using. So keep this in mind. But if you're wanting strength, right there it is. So this will increase print time, but there's one setting in here that we can actually speed up that print time. And let's go to that. So I've got my cubic setting, and you can see how it's just making all of these individual little blocks, and it's going to take a long time to 3D print because there are times where it's not actually printing and it's moving to the next part. One setting where we can speed this up a little bit is right here, Connect Infill Polygons. And what we're looking at right here is these are all individual polygons. So if we check this box and then slice it, so now we're going to see that it's actually doing a continuous line of creating all of our infill pattern. And this is going to speed up the print a lot. Instead of all of these individual little lines, it's actually 3D printing the lines together in one continuous path. So if you're using your line infill multiplier, I strongly recommend you using this as well, Connect Infill Polygons. And that'll help your speed just a little bit. And just to show you how much it'll change, this is 12 hours and 9 minutes for me to 3D print this entire thing. Now, if I just check this box and hit slice again, we're now down to 11 hours and 54 minutes. So if your line multiplier is more than 1, it's definitely worth checking this box and connect those infill polygons. Let's talk about our extra infill wall count. What that basically is it's creating walls of your infill that adhere better to your outer walls. And where this really comes into play, and I mean it's super beneficial, is the very tops of your models. Have you ever had the tops where the infill just didn't take care of it and there's like little gaps, or it sags a little bit because you didn't want a super high density of your infill? The extra infill wall count will definitely take care of that. Let me show you what it does. So I brought in another model to kind of show us what we're talking about. Because at the top of a smooth angle like this, sometimes we can get a little bit of gaps on the very last layers. So let's see what this looks like without the extra walls. So here it is, it's 3D printing, and you can see that there are gaps right here. And you can see right here, there is areas where it's not actually printing on anything because we're using a square infill with our grid. So when we get to these kind of areas, it's just, you're going to have some sagging, or it's not just going to adhere very well to the next layer when we're doing our shell. This is where we can actually add an extra wall. So let's go ahead and just take it to the max. So let's go ahead and just add 2 extra walls. So now let's slice this. So if we scrub down a little bit, we can actually see in orange, this is our infill. And it's creating a wall. And this is adhering to our outer shell, or our walls. So our infill is creating a wall that's connecting to our actual walls. This will actually create a stronger print as well. But the best part is when we're on the very top of our model. Now look at this. It's creating a ring right here for our next layer to actually 3D print onto. So the great thing is when we're 3D printing this, it's giving just a little bit more structure for it to 3D print onto when our infill isn't there. And that's crucial when we get closer and closer to a smaller point. So by the time we get to the very last infill spot, the hole is completely filled in, so this is a flat surface for it to 3D print onto. Now, like I've said with all these other settings, it can increase the amount of time it's 3D printing, and it also increases the amount of material you're using. Adhesion and bonding are absolutely critical when it comes to your 3D prints. The proper bonding and adhesion of your walls and of your infill, but also the bond between your infill and your walls is vitally important, because if you have separation, that can actually weaken the strength of your 3D prints. There is one setting here where we can increase that bond and make it stronger. So let me show you that. So what I'm talking about is the infill overlap percentage. And if we see here, this is the overlap of our infill into our wall. Now, if you see that this stops right at our actual wall for our infill. Now I'm going to increase this like all the way just so you can see. So if I say 100% and then I hit slice, this is what we're going to get. Our infill is going to overlap all the way into our walls at 100%. Now a higher overlap value does mean we're going to have a better bond between our infill and our walls. However, if you set this too high, it can lead to over extrusion with honestly a negative effect on your visual quality of your walls. This is where you can get blobs or zits. So, I don't recommend going to a straight 100%. Typically, I've found the default on Cura is 30%. And 30% is pretty good. I don't recommend going over anything of 50%. So you can see how it goes into the wall a little bit, and that's it. Now, if you're wanting to have a good bond between your walls and your infill, this isn't always the best method to do that. There's another thing in here where we can get a perfect bond in between our walls and our infill. Let me show you. So first I just want to show you, you can see that these just go right up to the wall and it goes over it at 30% like Cura's default right here. We can do something else, and that's not in the infill, that's in the walls. So let's go to walls. And if we come down here, we can see alternate extra wall. So let's click that and I'll show you what it does. So this actually creates an extra wall every other layer, so your infill is actually bonded beautifully to it. So if I go up one by one, you can see that it goes in and then it's being covered up. It goes in and covered up. So that is that extra wall being printed to be able to get a beautiful bond within your walls and infill. So if you want a strong bond, come up here to your wall setting and click on alternate extra wall. So let's talk about our infill wipe distance. And this is the distance to where before your actual line that it's printing of your infill gets to the walls, it will actually stop extruding because there is pressure on that nozzle pushing out filament. So it will actually stop. By the time it gets to the walls and moves to the next position, it has already alleviated the pressure and it's wiped off the nozzle to move over to the next part and then start printing there. This is a very nice setting to mess with, but you can get in trouble with it. So by default, our infill wipe distance is set to 0. Personally, I always leave it at 0, but things to keep in mind in general, a higher infill wipe distance can result in less over-extrusion onto the shell, which can improve your visual quality. However, setting it too high can cause under-extrusion on the infill, which could create weak points on your 3D print. So you've got to find that balance. But personally, I like to just keep it at 0 because I find some of these other settings that we've been going over really just helps with the strength and it doesn't affect the visual quality of the outside of your 3D print. Our next setting is infill layer thickness, and what this is this separates the amount of thickness that our layers can be on our infill versus our outer shell. So if we have our print quality set to a 0.1 for layer height, we can actually set the infill to a higher layer. But when it comes to our layer thickness, if we're wanting to truly increase the thickness of our infill layers, we have to keep in mind that it has to be a multiple of our layer height of our quality that we've set. For example, if I have a 0.1 millimeter layer height for the quality of my 3D print, so the outer shell is at a 0.1, and if I set my layer height infill to a 0.15, it's not divisible evenly by that. So it will actually round up to the nearest number it's divisible by. So if I have a 0.15 layer thickness for my infill, it's going to round it up to a 0.2. So keep that in mind. Let me show you where we can change it. So right now I have my infill layer thickness set to a 0.1 millimeter. Now if we zoom in, we see it's layer to layer. But if I change this to say, let's say a 0.3 for my infill layer thickness, what it's going to do is it's going to be printing multiple walls, as you see right here, it's printing multiple walls before it will print my actual infill. So it just jumps and then starts creating another one. Now this is a great setting to be able to save time, but this is also going to increase the amount of filament you're using because you're pushing out more for a 0.3 layer height. I'll also say printing a 0.3 layer height isn't the greatest option when you have a 0.4 millimeter nozzle size. But a 0.2 for a 0.4 millimeter nozzle, perfectly fine. That can help save you just a little bit of layers when it comes to printing your infill. So if you're concerned by the amount of filament you're using with your infill, there are certain things that we can do to change the amount it's using in certain areas to where it's still giving us the structure that we need on the inside of that model, especially at the top where those overhangs are coming into the model. And that is going to be over here in our gradual infill settings. Let me show you. So if we scroll down, we can see right here, gradual infill steps. And by default, it's set to 0. And let me just show you what we've got. We've got a 20% density and we're using a grid pattern. So as you can see here, we've just got 20% infill throughout our entire model from top to bottom. Now, let me show you if we add steps. So let's say 4 steps. Now, the next thing I'm going to show you is the gradual infill step height. Now, this is actually how far from the top these steps are going to go. So let's set this to 20. Now let's slice our file and show you what that's doing. Now, if you see in the very beginning of our model, it is printing a very low density infill. This is definitely not 20% like we just saw. Now, if we keep going up, you can see it hits another step where it starts creating more infill patterns. Then, if we keep going up again, you see it starts another pattern on top of it, to where it's starting to get more dense as we go. Once we get closer to the top, there's our 20% infill right there. So then it's going to print that 20% infill until the very top of our model. So if we go to the default gradual infill step height at 1.5 in Cura, you can see as we're going up, it is actually leaving this really low infill for quite some time. And it's not until we get to the very top where it starts getting more dense. So you can see that it's printing some and gets more and more until we get to that 20%. So this is a really great way to be able to save all of that additional filament, because think about all of the filament used. So if we come here and we can see this is using 56 grams of filament. Now let's turn this off and let's bring this back down to 0. Now let's slice it. Now we're using 130 grams. So it was 56 grams. We're saving over half of the amount of filament used because it's all in the infill of this 3D print. So if you're looking to save filament, this is definitely the setting for you. So if you have a 3D model that has a lot of overhangs, one setting might help you, and that is printing your infill before your walls. Typically, by default, Cura will actually print the walls first and then the infill. You can actually change this and make it print your infill first. There are pros and cons when it comes to printing your infill first versus your walls first. One pro is the overhangs. It will definitely help with those overhangs. It'll actually have something for those walls to actually adhere to instead of just kind of printing out in the middle of nowhere. But one of the cons, sometimes it can give you bad surface quality. So your print might be a little rough because those walls are trying to print onto your infill. Keep that in mind, but it is worth testing, especially if you have some models that have a lot of overhangs and you're trying to print them without supports. And to change this setting, all you do is come here to infill before walls and just check it. So now when we slice our model and we play through, we can see that it's printing our infill first, then it's printing our walls. And just so you can see it when it's unchecked, when we play through, it prints our walls first, like the default, and then it prints our infill. So one setting that I think is just, it's underutilized by people, and that is the minimum infill area. This setting is amazing. For you people out there that are printing your 3D prints to paint, and let's say they're holding a sword or something like that. Maybe it's a thicker sword, but it's still something that could be delicate and break easy. This is it. I use this setting all the time. What this does is it determines if there is a gap or, a hollow void where infill would be, and it's only a certain size, it's just going to print it solid. That's right. It will print that entire area solid to make those little things a lot more strong. So, if you have a low wall count and there's some voids that are, maybe skinny or something like that coming off of your models, you can make them stronger while still having a decent sized infill. So let me show you how to change this awesome setting. So I've created this little model, and you can see that there's these little pillar legs. And I really need infill in this area, not really in this area. So if I just kind of scrub down, you can see that I've got a 20% infill, and it's going all the way down through these pillars. And you know what? I want these little pillars to be a lot stronger. So I can come down here. I'm going to go to my minimum infill area. Now, the important thing to understand about your minimal infill area is this is millimeters squared. Now that you see where to change this, the biggest thing to keep in mind is this is millimeters squared. So this is like a cubic foot. So a cubic foot is 1 foot wide, 1 foot deep, and 1 foot tall. This is millimeters squared. So it is 1 millimeter wide, 1 millimeter deep, and 1 millimeter tall. That is the volume of what this setting is. So if you've got a bigger area and you want that to be printed solid, you're probably going to have to go a lot higher than you think you need to. So let me show you. So for right now, if I do, let's say 10 millimeters squared, and I slice this, you can see right there, there's still infill here. But if I go to 150 millimeters squared, if I come down, look what happens. This is printing these pillars solid plastic for me to make them as strong as I physically can make them. So if you're prototyping things and you need to have a certain area that's thinner, stronger, this is your setting. Or let's say that this could be a sword and I want this to be really strong on the person that's holding it. And then once it comes to a more open area, this is what it does. It starts printing my infill, so I have my infill pattern exactly how I want it. This is a fantastic setting to be able to make those little small intricate areas a lot stronger. But remember, this is millimeters squared, so you've got to have this a high enough setting to where it will actually fill it in. All right, now this next one is an absolute, it's a gem. You're going to love it. And that is infill supports. Infill supports are fantastic because they act like external supports, but only on the inside, producing infill only where it's absolutely needed to be able to print your 3D model. So let me show you where it's at and how you can use it. All right, so I have this awesome model from Eastman, which is a Darth Vader, and it's support free. But you know what isn't support free? The inside of this model. You definitely need infill for this because there are really harsh angles that are going inwards for your model. So if we jump over to preview and just kind of come through here, you can see that I'm using a 20% infill and it's just infilling the whole thing. But I don't want that because I feel like I don't need all of that infill. So this is where you come right here, infill support. So this is only focusing on the tops of the model and where it needs to print. So let's go to the very top view of this and really see what it's doing. So you can see there is our pattern that's going all the way through it perfectly. Now if we just click on our infill support and reslice this, one thing to note, this does take longer to slice. Personally though, I would rather waste 5 minutes here of letting it slice and save hours on my 3D printers. Just saying. Let's get back to it. So here we go. I've already sliced this. So now if we come down, we can see our infill, but there's some random gaps here now. And that is because we don't need infill here, so it's not printing it. And if we keep coming down, you can see it does it throughout the entire model. Like, there's areas where we don't need infill, and it's not doing it. Now, sometimes you'll get these little pieces that are hanging out in the middle of nowhere, and I've never experienced any issues with these because it's just going to squirt it out and then it's going to move to another piece of infill. It doesn't need to look pretty on the inside of this, and just keep that in mind because you will get some layers that just are printing out in the middle of nowhere because it's only looking at where it needs to actually print. So scrubbing through here, you can see there are gaps. It's still printing quite a bit of filament. So one of the last infill settings is your edge thickness support. And all this really does is make your infill just a little thicker where it's actually meeting the skin of your 3D prints. It's okay to increase this a little bit, but for the most part, I just like to leave it as it is, because all of those other things that I've taught you of how you can have alternate layers and things like that, and the overlap, those are really giving it that extra support it needs. So one thing about this is you just always have to make sure it's a multiple of your actual layer height, because if you start getting into crazy numbers, it's just going to round up or round down. So just keep it divisible by your layer height. So that's it. Those are all of the settings in Cura when it comes to your infill. I know it's a lot, but if you start messing with these just one thing at a time, you're going to find that you're going to be getting higher quality prints because your infill plays such a huge part into your 3D prints. Now keep in mind that this was just one setting in Cura, the infill. There are other settings to really master and hone. So if you've enjoyed this video, I've got another video where I am actually going through every single setting that I look at when I'm setting up my 3D print files, because we're going through a lot of settings right now, but there's certain ones that I always have to keep an eye out on. And you can see all of the things that I think are important in this video. Thanks a lot for watching. I wish you a great day, and I'll see you right here in this video. Still slicing. Still slicing. Still slicing. Fun to actually see what they actually look. Dang it.